What's propaganda? Got a dude with a cowboy hat talking to you about propaganda. Why not? But seriously, what's propaganda? You ever think about that? You can look up the definition. I don't have the definition on hand, but I'm pretty sure an antigram, a synonym for the definition of propaganda, would be information presented for misleading purposes. I believe that would be the definition of propaganda. When I was younger, I used to think the term propaganda meant lie. Somebody told me that propaganda was being used in advertising. Propaganda was being used in government solicitations, that you were just being lied to. But I was later corrected, and to this day I understand that propaganda doesn't necessarily mean a lie, though that's where my gut goes when I hear the terminology. Propaganda means misinformation, information that's not necessarily correct, right? But can be misleading. I've never really had much use for understanding propaganda until I had to educate myself on how advertising works, American history and advertising. There's a lot of ground to cover there. After the Third Industrial Revolution here in the United States, if you don't know what the Third Industrial Revolution was, that was a period of extreme industrious growth between the 1920s and the 1940s, where this country established a very vibrant electrical grid. This country established a very sophisticated railway system, and this country established a very, very booming and economical highway system, right? By around the 1950s, this country had sustained serious economic growth from its railroad system, which we all commonly take for granted to this day. Its electrical system, which provides all of us power. And I'd say probably the most significant would be the agricultural system. So that's the Third Industrial Revolution. It happened all over the world, much like with our deindustrial revolution that's happening right now. The whole world through that time period, in the early 1900s, last century, the whole world went through a booming bust of industrious growth known as the Third Industrial Revolution. God trails. Nice hat, thank you. There's a great story with this hat. A really good story. I got to figure out a way to tell it that's not frightening. Anyways. So I was trying to touch base on the history of advertising in this country, which is insane. The history of... okay, my hat, sorry. Jumping topics there. Put simply, I was driving through Pendleton, Oregon when I got this hat. There were wildfires everywhere. I thought I was going to die. Right? I just drove out of a sweltering wildfire with my tires almost melted to my car. Hit a truck stop to get myself a much needed water. And in a bin sits this hat all by itself about 3 months after the 4th of July. Nobody said anything to me. I looked at it. I looked around for the person that owned this hat, and there was a little sticker on it, and I just simply said, "Hey, is this for sale?" And they were like, "Yeah." So I bought it. I got the hat, but I'll never forget what I went through to get the hat. But no, that's what I was doing. That's the story anyways. I'm going to say hi. Hi. Magali M. God Trails. So the history of advertising in this country, it's dark, man. We didn't used to have all the laws that we have now, right? At one point in time in this country, if there was something for sale around the turn of the third industrial revolution, if there was something for sale, they just put it in the papers and sold it to you. Like heroin, right? Try Kellogg's Corn Flakes, brand new product, just came out this week. Imagine this back then. And also try heroin with it, right? Get yourself a Chinaman from down on the docks. This is the stuff, you can look this up, that used to be in the papers back in the 1920s, 1930s. No filter. No child endangerment laws. You know, hiring a child to have them mangled in industrious agricultural work just didn't seem to be a problem. This is the history of advertising in this country. Take it easy. You're local. So much of what's affiliated with propaganda in this country almost always can be tracked back historically to advertising. Because as they had to make more laws to make sure people were not misled by advertising, they had to control the information. And this is where your propaganda specialists were brought in to make sure people could give the information for selling their product that they needed to, and at the same time limit the information to where people could not get hurt. So that's the history of advertising in this country as propaganda pertains to it. Non-government purposes apply. Yes, sir, I think darn near everything in this country that's good or bad historically can be tracked back to advertising in some way, shape, or form. The whole inception of this technology was advertising based. Everything we've done with this technology was in the name of advertising. You know, back when the first iPhone came out, the big cutting edge angle for everybody was targeted advertising, right? You could more effectively than ever find out a way to get your products into people's minds, houses, hearts, and homes with this targeted advertising. And now targeted advertising really isn't very relevant except with the big corporations. But that's what precipitated the whole movement with this technology. And most people don't think about that. I'm a God-fearing Christian man talking about advertising. Very American. Yeah, I think about the third industrial revolution a lot. I think that officially makes me, what do they call it? Old. But my grandma, she lived through the Great Depression. Incidentally, the third industrial revolution brought us the Great Depression. A lot of people don't know about that. You have to study your world history, your global history, your national history. One of the things that caused the Great Depression was something called the Dust Bowl, right? During all this early economic growth here in the country, one of the benefits was to redefine how we do our agriculture here in the United States. After the third industrial revolution, we were supposed to have vibrant crops all throughout the Midwest. After that growth development, the third industrial revolution, we did successfully flatten out most of the Midwest, and we turned it into a giant bowl. And you can look up the history of this. It's called the Dust Bowl. The history of the Dust Bowl in the United States of America. The people who decided to do this, which it later turned out decades later to be a very intelligent idea because it brought us the breadbasket of the United States, which we commonly know as the Midwest, a very, very, to this day, effective and efficient way of feeding millions of Americans every month. But during its early critical inception period, the Midwest encountered something called the Dust Bowl. And that was because they never did it before. They hadn't anticipated the consequences of what they had done by flattening out the Midwest and not understanding the natural weather phenomenon, encapsulating it. the winds started kicking up miles and miles of flat dust land off of these crops before they were planted. And it covered cities, a lot of them no longer with us, in dust, like blankets of ash from a volcano. These cities, a lot of them just vanished in the pages of history. True. It wasn't until, and you guys might relate to this, about a decade after the Dust Bowl phenomenon, man-made phenomenon, that the White House of the time acted upon it. And in doing so, it wasn't until the White House front lawn, where our president currently resides on a day-to-day basis waving to people, was completely covered in dirt. This was a decade after the initial phenomenon had occurred. All of those states were complaining to the White House for almost 10 years before they did anything, and nobody thinks they would have done anything according to the pages of history, had the dirt not actually almost blanketed the White House into oblivion. That finally forced them to act and understand that they did have a national security, economic security problem on their hands. History 101. Got to know your history, folks. You won't know where you're going if you don't know where you've been. You won't know where you're going if you don't know where you've been. We got a long track history in this country of government not listening to the people, obviously. And we got a long track history of how that got ratified. God, trails. Okay, and this is the last thing I'll conclude with. I'm just doing my due diligence. I study history a lot, so I love to talk about history. We're going to jump out of the third industrial revolution phase, and we're going to move on to taxation, and this is how I'm going to conclude. The amendment for taxation in the United States Constitution was never ratified, right? Now, roughly what that means is it's never been constitutional to tax American citizens. Now, you can throw this at any historian you want, preferably somebody with a real degree, not one in liberal arts, and they'll concur with you. The amendment for taxation in the United States Constitution is not constitutional. It was never ratified through the Founding Fathers, the Federalist Papers. So every time you pay your taxes, state level, federal level, according to the Founding Fathers, that shouldn't happen. That's just a fun forward thought experiment for everybody to think about who's out there trying to get their constitutional causality on. The amendment for taxation was never ratified. Well, I got to go get dinner ready. Have a great night.